What I'm going to do is just cut right back to the chase, really, because everything that's in this paper is published in the paper. So I'll give you the reference to that at the end. But actually, just what I wanted to do was just follow on a bit of what Josh was talking about in terms of commenting and websites and where people want to be. And I know that my own experience when I was at the Australian Museum, when we redid our website, it was a totally open website for people to comment. And what we found is that people didn't comment. And I think a lot of that reason is that either they have nothing to say or the web isn't really a commenting space. People were more active on Facebook and other social media channels. So I guess the lesson for us there was, well, you actually go to where the people are. So you can create it's a beautiful online scholarly catalogue, but you might find that your visitation might be high, yet what you see as interaction is low because they're actually talking about that in other places. So that's where the web is going. And we also had a discussion yesterday in the digital production workshop about rolling out your product, and that's the whole thing about, well, you need to think about the marketing and the publishing and the getting the message out there before you even really start, because it's great to have something there, but if nobody knows about it, that's just some things from my end. The first things I was going to talk about is kind of a bit of literature and things like that. Again, it's in the paper, so you can have a read of that. But what I just wanted to focus on quickly was just 3 trends that I see are affecting how visitors are learning in their own lives, and then how that actually affects the museum experience. So the 3 I'm looking at is gamification and multi-screening and MOOCs. So I'll just go to my notes. Okay, who here plays games? Who here plays Facebook games? Well, they're games. So gamification, to me, is one of the biggest things impacting on how people learn. And there's quite a bit that's been written around about how the principles of gaming can really be applied to good learning experiences. And there was a report put out by the Demos Foundation in 2006, and they were the first to recognise that gaming was actually a really legitimate form of learning. And back then they looked at World of Warcraft and saw, okay, well, what skills were these people actually developing? And the kinds of skills that people were getting, and these were mostly young people, were having to attract, evaluate and recruit members to their teams, creating apprenticeship programs, so actually training people up, orchestrating strategy, so there's a lot of strategy going on in those games, and also managing disputes. Again, these are kinds of things that are real-life learning experiences. There's a book written by Thomas and Seeley Brown called A New Culture of Learning, and again, all this is referenced in the paper, so it's a very easy read, actually, and that's a really good book that talks about how learning has changed, and they do actually take the principles of gaming and talk about how that can relate to the learning environments. And they came up with something that I think is really interesting for museums in terms of how we learn internally as organisations. They came up with this principle of what gamers do, which is they hang out, they mess around and they geek out. And what that means is hanging out just means what gamers do is they just learn to be with others in social spaces, online or wherever it is they happen to be playing. But these spaces are actually mediated by digital technology, and they're starting to answer questions about what is my relationship to other people. The second process, called messing around, what that allows learners to do is to unpack and experiment with familiar things in order to try new things and acquire different skills. And messing around is where learners start to develop a social relationship and thinking about what can they explore. And then finally, what they call geeking out is, I'll actually read what they say this is. It's an experiential, embodied sense of learning within a rich social context of peer interaction, feedback and knowledge construction, enhanced by technological infrastructure that promotes intense learning. What geeking out really means is learning in its deepest form, and some of you that might have actually looked in the museum learning literature might have come across an idea that somebody called Csikszentmihalyi and Hermansen talked about in 1995, which was the concept of flow, and that's what they were talking about back then, is that's the kind of experience that you want to try and get visitors to be engaged with, because flow means a deep learning experience. And what I found interesting about this idea of hanging out, messing around and geeking out, is that that actually is a way to kind of conceptualise how a museum might do that within their spaces. The second trend is something that I've been thinking about a lot, which I've called multi-screening. And I talk about, I mean, we all multitask, right? So some of you are probably online. You might be tweeting, checking your email, sending text messages while I'm talking up here, and that's cool. I have no problem with that. So multitasking is something that we're used to, right? What I'm thinking about now is that we've got this idea now that we're actually multi-screening, which means that we're using different screens at different times and often at the same time, and that we now have 4 screens in our lives, and these are the screens that we have. We have our smartphones, who know us better than our partners often. We have the television, which people thought there was going to be the death of television, but social media and social technologies has actually reinvented the way we watch TV. We still do have our PCs, and I'm actually quoting from some Google research here, but what they would talk, and they did a lot of research across 11 countries to see how people were using these screens. And I would have thought, you know, the death of the PC and that kind of stuff. But what they found in their research was that actually people needed still these computers to do what I call grunt work. So for me, it was like doing my tax. I still had to do that on a desktop because it was just impossible almost to do it on a tablet. And the other thing that Google found in their research was that tablet use is really very interesting process, because a tablet is a very social process, and a tablet is often what we're using when we're using the other screens. They also found that with tablets, interestingly, a lot of people that they spoke to started, say, a purchase or something on a tablet and then switched to another device. So they often finished it on their PC, and some of that had to do with security and things. There's also a really interesting report by Common Sense Media, and they've looked at children from 0 to 8. It's a US study, but it's kind of applicable to everybody, I think. What they found that children's access to mobile media devices increased significantly since 2011, but the time that kids spent on these devices tripled. And I hear a lot about people complaining about, you know, kids, they're always on screens and blah, 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 blah. Well, I actually argue that we're the same. Adults, we're always on screens as well. So we're all multi-screeners. What I've always been thinking about, and again in museums, we often talk about content is king. We spoke about that yesterday at the workshop. You know, we've got all this content. But what I'm starting to think about is actually not the device content that is the critical thing. It's actually the device context. So it's kind of like where you're using these screens and what you're doing. So my work at the Australian Museum, we found that often people were looking at our website as they were visiting, as they were on the bus or something like that towards the museum. So the context of what that device is showing you becomes more critical than actually the content. So similar to what Josh was saying, you need a great lot of content that you can then repurpose for the different kinds of screens that people are using. The other thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and I see this, I'm an audience researcher, so I'm out watching visitors all the time, and you see them going up to static television screens and they're scrolling and swiping. And I talk, even though they're static screens, and I talk a lot to museum designers who hate me because I really question what they're doing. And I say, well, okay, well, what's the future of a text panel, for example, if people are used to either scrolling or swiping for their information? And we need to kind of start thinking about how people are using devices in their lives and how that then relates to the physical space. The final trend that I just wanted to touch on is MOOCs. Has anybody done a massive open online course? Did you finish it? No. Did you finish it? No. Did you finish it? No. I did too. Did I finish them? No. So again, I'll just actually, for those of you that don't know, a MOOC is a model of educational delivery that is massive. Theoretically, there's no limit to enrolment. It's open. Anyone can participate, usually no cost. It's online, and learning activities take place across the web. And it's a course structured around a set of learning goals. MOOCs are very disruptive, and it actually was hard writing this paper, and my excuse to Nancy for not doing it earlier was that everything's changing so fast, I need to write it at the last minute. It was a good excuse. But anyway, I was reading something about MOOCs just this morning, talking about, well, how they're actually disrupting education, and actually democratising education. And there's a woman called Daphne somebody who started Coursera, and she's got a really cool TED Talk if you want to find out about democratisation of learning. It's a very powerful, she's South African, and the reason she started it was because people there were so desperate to get education. There was stampedes to get into universities and people were dying, so it was kind of like she wanted to open all this up. I think MOOCs are very important for museums, not so much in delivering stuff to visitors, but actually in curators and other people within the museum thinking about, well, how can we deliver things, and trying out MOOCs. And I would actually go and do one, even if you don't finish, because, as I said, the first MOOC I did was funny. I think Phyllis Hecht, who's at this conference, we were also in it, and we hated the MOOC that we were doing, so we formed a splinter group and went off and did our own thing. Again, learning in the 21st century is about participation and choice and control, and so we just all went off and started our own Facebook group, complained about the MOOC, and then went on with the conversation that we wanted to have. And that's a really cool thing, and that's not a problem. The other thing that I've been toying with is, okay, well, what the theorist in me comes out. What is a learning theory for the 21st century museum? And I've gone back to one of the old guns of museum education and learning theory, George Hine, who talked a lot about constructivism. And what I also did, and this is a terrible slide, and it looks terrible on the museums and the website as well. So go to my blog and actually download the paper, because it looks nice and I'll get more hits. That's exciting. So what I'm trying to do is actually, the theorist in me again is kind of saying, okay, well, what does learning look like in the physical space? What does it look like in the online space, usually website and social media? And what does it look in the mobile space? And how is that actually the same, and what's different? Because one of the other big things that I've argued quite a lot in papers that I've written is this whole idea of how are we going to integrate the physical, the online and the mobile spaces, because that's the spaces that our visitors are learning in. All right, so I won't go through that. And here's Nancy, who I just mentioned. Luckily, you just came in later. Okay, so rich learning experiences then in the 21st century are ones that encourage discovery, interaction. They cater for unexpected things, they provide pathways, and they give a taste for what happens behind the scenes of a museum. They provide rich, challenging content. It's real content, it's authoritative content. It's meaningful, but it encourages questions and is much about what, and again, the example that Josh gave about comments and people being able to talk, it gives enough room for people to have discussions. Social interactions, and this idea that I was talking about of hanging out, messing around and geeking out, this kind of social interaction that we can provide. Yes, so that's that. Okay. I was teaching museums and the digital at Sydney University for the last 3 semesters, and actually did a subject of that here, which was interesting. So I kind of looked back into what was going on, and museums have really been experimenting and being in these spaces for 45 years, although if you read the Twitter feed from this morning, there's a bit of a dispute about when all of that started. But anyway, 45 years ago, the MCN was, Museum Computer Network was established, and museums have kind of gone on since then. Gone on and maybe not changed very much. But in an early text about this whole thing, it was stated that users need to be taught about new technologies gradually, consistently and persistently. 10 years later, Herminia Din and Phyllis Hecht talked about, well, okay, that's still true, users need to be taught about that, but as technology's effect on museums' business processes and strategic planning grows, staff need to understand the role of technology even more urgently. This is almost 10 years ago they're talking about here. They also said the training in specific technical skills is still important, but the focus should be on understanding the conceptual underpinnings of technology in the museum. And I think, again, we were having, if you're watching the Twitter stream and what Susan said this morning, it's not about the technology, it's about the content and the experience, and the technology comes later. So what I feel in 2013, so coming kind of almost 20 years on, this need is still urgent, and an appreciation of technology is still required by people, but the focus now has to shift to creating strong synergies between the physical, online and mobile experiences, and also getting a better understanding of how audiences are interacting and behaving across these, which is some of the work that I've been doing and blogging about in the past. You know, what do people know a QR code is? What do they think NFC is? All that kind of stuff. We need to know about that. I'm just going to finish because we can spend a bit of time talking or whatever. Just by saying that Professor Stephen Heppel, who's a pretty well-known online digital educator, he was out in Australia a few years ago, and he was saying that actually this is the most exciting time to be working in education, and it's the most exciting time to be working in education and museums, I feel, because the technology provides us with some great opportunities to do stuff that we could never have conceived of before. But I feel the challenge for museums is how they actually incorporate their tools into their everyday work practices. Again, the Twitter discussion this morning about, well, MoMA's now just pushing people to Wikipedia for their biographies of artists, and, you know, why not? What a great idea. So what I'm thinking is how these technologies actually change in delivery models, so how are we going to do that? And how museums themselves can actually become learning organisations, and how we can empower our staff to do that whole thing that I was talking about hanging out, messing around and geeking out in technology spaces. There needs to be some reallocation of resources. There needs to be different mindsets about how we might be doing things in the future. And I think we need to provide access for staff to a range of these technologies to play around with. And these are some of the ways that museums can encourage staff to embrace change, to learn from it. And at the end of the day, we're all about the audience. And again, it came out of the digital production workshop yesterday when we're struggling with, okay, well, what is it we want to provide? Well, actually, it comes down to the users and the audience themselves. And that's what we're about. Again, audiences, we had this Twitter discussion this morning. It was like, well, if audiences are insisting on this change, well, they vote with their feet. So if we're not providing them with information and resources and experiences that actually meet what their needs are, well, then they just won't turn up. So I'll just show you where you can find all of this in a nice format. Sorry, I hope I don't get... Okay, so this blog is called how do I get home? It's called musedigi.wordpress.com. It's a blog that we've just started. I've started with a couple of people at the Maritime Museum that I work at now and a few other folks, and here we're just blogging about our experiences. And yeah, so I've got the stuff on the workshop I did yesterday, but it's also got the paper here and a few other things, bits and pieces. So if you want to have a look at it, have a look at that. So I might just leave it there if people have questions or whatever, and gives you some time to talk. It's musdigi.wordpress.com. And I'll just tweet that out right now. Yeah? Got a question? Oh, yeah, so I've finished. So if you've got a question...
Thank you, Lynda.
Thank you.